We got a good mix today on the show, from international intrigue on trade, in which an activist is thrown into jail trying to protect workers, to the relatively mundane swamp of Florida politics, where we find a slew of candidates trying to inject some life into the state Democratic Party. This is Jonathan Tassini, and welcome to the show. It's great to have you on the show for July 20th, 2020. Of course, as usual, a reminder, our major sponsor is the American Postal Workers Union that fights for dignity, respect, and good wages for its 200,000 members and retirees, as well as 2,000 private sector workers. You can become a supporter of this program. We really urge you to do that. It helps us keep this program on the show, bringing you the information you're probably not going to find in most other places. You can do that in two ways. You can either go over to workinglife.org, look for the podcast link, and then follow your way over to Patreon, where you can sign up either on a one-time basis or a regular monthly contribution and become a supporter of the show. Or if you're more comfortable because of your political contributions and you've used ActBlue, we've partnered up with ActBlue, and you can find us over there. Also, the Working Life Network, the Working Life Show with Jonathan Tassini at ActBlue. And there, too, you can become a regular contributor, which, of course, we'd like you to do. Or if you want to just do it one time, that would be great, too. Now, before I get to my segments, I want to say one thing. By the time you're watching this show, I'm guessing, Jeff Bezos, one of the great scars on the economic landscape, will have finished his song and dance testimony before Congress during a hearing that mostly focuses on the massive anti-competitive power of big tech firms like Amazon, Google, and Facebook. But long before today, before his testimony, Jeff Bezos has always been the poster child for me of a CEO who does not give a shit about workers and only cares about a single thing. He actually doesn't care about communities either. He only cares about his wealth and becoming the richest man in the world and becoming even more wealthy at the expense of everyone else. This man is a scar on humanity. He makes billions effectively from the death, injury, illnesses, and just plain stress that Amazon workers go through in those warehouses every single day. I have a complete ban, personally, on giving a dime to that shitty human being. Now, you want more evidence? Two reports that I dug into back some time ago when I did a segment on Amazon, it probably goes back 2 years ago, really make the case. The first was a deep dive, a really terrific article in The Atlantic that was called "Ruthless Quotas at Amazon Are Permanently Maiming Employees." And it was coming out of an investigation by the Center for Investigative Reporting, which found that the company's obsession with speed had turned its warehouses into, quote, injury mills. That pretty much says it all. And the article, which I recommend to you, you can look at it and find it in the Atlantic archives. Just look for it on Google. Funny that I should say Google, right? Just goes into gory detail. And it shows how people are abused in those warehouses every day. The second was a report at the time by the New York Committee for Occupational Safety and Health, which looked at the Amazon Fulfillment Center on Staten Island in New York City, and it was just as damning. The majority of workers, 80%, were pressured to work harder or faster at their facility. 66% expressed experiencing physical pain while performing their work duties. Think about that. And 42% continued to experience pain even when they weren't at work. And none of that has changed. And it's gotten worse, especially during the pandemic, because Amazon workers have been getting sick and in some cases dying because of their work in the Amazon warehouses, which also feeds directly into Amazon's extreme anti-unionism. At least one worker has been fired for trying to unionize the Staten Island facility because of safety concerns he had for himself and his coworkers. You want more? Amazon is the king of the hill when it comes to not paying taxes. It employs scores of people, lawyers and accountants, whose sole job it is to keep Bezos' money from the hands of regular people. What I mean by that is that when Amazon and Bezos do not pay taxes on the huge wealth that the company and he accumulate, that means we pay more in taxes. And our services get crippled because there isn't enough money at the local, state, and federal level to provide the kinds of services that regular people need. Now, the list goes on and on. So, bottom line, remember, do not use Amazon. There are plenty of local alternatives. Support local businesses. Do not give Jeff Bezos another dime. Okay, so I've been all over, as my longtime audience knows, the trade fights going back a very long time, actually going back to the original NAFTA in 1992. Yes, I'm that old. And as you all know, the Congress recently passed NAFTA 2.0 earlier this year. I'll just say right away, the first NAFTA was an abomination. The newer one was just horrendous. But also, we have to be clear that with or without these so-called free trade deals, capitalism marches on and abuses people, as we saw actually in last week's episode, which you can see in our archive, where I talked about the enslavement of the Uyghurs in China, enslaved on behalf of the global supply chain of big brands and big companies. But sure enough, NAFTA 2.0 is law, and it hasn't even been in effect for more than a few days, and we already can see that it's a sham. Because the big piece of this deal, one of the so-called improvements, was all about helping workers in Mexico earn a decent living, especially making sure that they had the right to join independent unions. And that ain't happening. Now, as usual, when it comes to getting the best thinking about trade, I turn to my longtime comrade and global trade warrior, Lori Wallach, the director of Global Trade Watch. So I feel like, Lori, that this is almost predictable. And I know you're perhaps more optimistic because you're in the middle of all this work. You have been for decades in this trade fight. And I want to quote from an important paper that you wrote, points that you made on your website, always great information on your website. You wrote here about the implementation of NAFTA. The new NAFTA came into effect on July 1st. On paper, the new NAFTA, with improved labor terms added and extreme big pharma monopolies and ISDS investor rights removed, is better than the original, but it won't benefit people unless it's effectively enforced. Okay, so I get that it's better than the original, which of course is not saying much because the first one in some way was crap and terrible. But wasn't this predictable, at least from the point of view of enforcement on the Mexican side? Maybe I'm being too pessimistic.
Well, the original NAFTA for workers and the planet was like 12 rings of the lower part of hell. So you're down in the bottom of hell, of daily disaster, torment, devastation. And the revised NAFTA, brings you at least up to the crust. I would say it's a ring or two above the crust. And you certainly have a lot more that needs to be done before you have a good agreement. But the point was it should stop the damage. It should stop the ongoing, or at least lessen the ongoing damage. And the key piece to that was going to be if the new rules got enforced. Because the key thing was for workers in Mexico, for the first time literally since the revolution, to have independent unions that could actually fight for their wages versus the so-called protection unions that protect the boss, that are endemic in workplaces in Mexico, so that Mexican workers now make 40% less than manufacturing workers in China. It's $2 an hour wages in high-tech US plants, of big multinationals making cars and refrigerators and aerospace equipment. And that is dragging down wages throughout North America. So the whole promise of the revised NAFTA was if the new labor rights, which were much better, and the enforcement on paper could raise new labor rights, union protections, and therefore have higher wages, that would reduce the incentives to outsource jobs from the US and downward pressure on wages here. And
okay, so let me just catch this though. What you said was on paper. And so if I'm on the Mexican side and I'm negotiating this, I'm saying, okay, yeah, on paper we'll do this, fine, check this off, check that one off. But and I don't claim to be an expert on Mexican labor law or Mexican law in general, but from afar, from knowing at least a certain amount, it just seemed to be unreasonable and at least a fantasy that in that country, which, as you know, violence is rampant, you've got drug cartels controlling vast parts of the country. I just didn't see how in practice this would actually happen.
Well, that was going to be my last sentence. And it remains to be seen if it actually translates into changes on the ground. Now, here's the good news. There is in this new NAFTA something that doesn't exist in any other trade agreement, and that is a rapid response labor enforcement mechanism that actually gives workers the ability to make the actual companies suffer. So typical trade agreements, you violate the trade agreement, it takes 3 years to go through a process, and then trade sanctions get imposed on one country by the other country. And so the whole country, the government maybe faces tariffs, but the actual companies, no problem. They can continue abusing workers. What's different in NAFTA is there's a system that within 6 months has an individual company facing direct fines on their goods. And if they continue the violation or have a repeated violation in any plant in the same corporate family, their goods can be stopped at the border. So you've just hung a sort of Damocles over the actual bosses, and that is transformational. So if that works, when those cases get filed and that starts to work, that actually could force change. Because it's not just some boss is saying, oh, well, there are tariffs on the Mexican government, so it is. Instead, it's, oh, crap, my goods can't get to the market, or I'm going to face directly millions of dollars of fines. So that's what we have to see if it works. And those first cases may include these outrageous attacks that have been happening by right-wing governors in the border states who at this moment are trying their best to smash this new labor rights in the new NAFTA, but also there's a new Mexican labor law that implements it. And they're doing their best to basically tell the president of Mexico to go to hell and that they're not going to change anything. And it's gotten really nasty.
So one of the things that's happening, and maybe we can drill down into this a little bit without getting too deep in the weeds, they are trying to undermine the law by filing all sorts of cases at the Mexican Supreme Court. And I assume that's a way of delaying and pushing things off and essentially undermining the entire effort to enforce this agreement.
So there are some 500 cases, many filed by the particular federation of corrupt. You give them money, they say you have a union, but the workers have no vote, have no rights, and the union contract is for low wages intentionally. That whole racket has filed, those unions have filed 500 cases. They're all being consolidated at the Mexican Supreme Court. And they probably would have had, some of them would have started to have hearings by now, but the courts were closed down for 4 months because of COVID. They just reopened on July 1st in Mexico. So yes, it's an attempt to gut the law that implements the new rights in NAFTA, and it remains to be seen how it's going to play out.
So these cases were actually filed before the official implementation date of July 1st, and it's just coincidental that the courts have reopened at the same time that NAFTA is supposed to be implemented, which in fact kind of says they've been successful, meaning the people who are trying to undermine the agreement, at delaying the implementation, the effective implementation.
Well, the Mexican labor law is actually in effect. So the civil law system, which is the system in Mexico, is kind of different than the common law system. There aren't any injunctions against the law. There are a handful of injunctions against particular replacement contracts of specific unions that have tried to use the law. So the whole law isn't enjoined, it's in effect. But what's happening is there's a lot of political repression, a lot of political violence being applied to anyone who's trying to actually exercise their rights. Now, if the Supreme Court throws out the law, then it's gone. But in the interim, when it's in effect, still pending review, all these political attacks against people trying to use those rights are having a very chilling effect.
Now, you and I are both great labor supporters, great union supporters. So I'm always cautious about using the term protection unions and alleging that some union is corrupt. But in Mexico, and I want you to explain this in a minute or two, in Mexico, the system is quite corrupt in that these unions are essentially run by companies and by the very forces that are trying to oppress workers, right?
Yeah. So the Mexican Constitution from the Revolutionary era requires almost all workplaces to have a union. So what has developed over time and is now a high art is connected to each of the conservative political parties are these union federations. For the pre-party is called the CTM, and for the PON, the super right-wing party, is the CROC, C-R-O-C, an acronym that is not favorable but accurate
Yes.
when translated to English. And those federations are basically like businesses. So here's how it works. You are going to open up the Tassini Motor Parts Company in Matamoros. You're building your plant. You haven't hired a first worker. You're not even going to start production for 6 months. You call in the local CTM, or in that state it's PON. It's even more right wing. You call in the guy from CROC, from the Federation. You say, hey, I'm going to have an auto parts plant. I'm going to have 500 workers. And they say, okay, if you want a contract, which you have to by law in Mexico have a contract, it's going to cost you $20,000. And let's talk about what terms you want. Oh, you want to pay him $1.50 an hour? Okay, that sounds good. No overtime pay, just $1.50. Okay, 80 hours in the pay period is ridiculous. You should do 120. And they basically sit there and come up with favorable terms to protect the boss. They get paid cash. They take the contract. The workers haven't chosen the union, haven't approved a collective bargaining agreement. It's really like a business. This political party related business takes the union contract, files it, gets it registered, checks the box. As the boss, you now have the required union. The workers come, they have no idea there's even a union. Their wages are being deducted to pay dues to this operation who is only loyal to the boss. That's a protection union. Or in Mexico, that they call them sindicatos blancos, a white union, basically not a real one.
So you picked a company in the automotive industry to give my name to it. And while I would never, ever start a company, you picked really the wrong industry, because I'm one of those men that was born with no interest in cars and two left hands when it comes to looking at an engine. I wouldn't have a clue, but I get the concept. And so what would happen if I was an independent union and I wanted to organize? And this may be one way we can slide into the story of Susana Prieto Terrazas, who you've been really working closely with, and what happened to her when she tried to represent workers who wanted an independent union.
So in every Mexican state, there is a thing called a labor board, and that's where you go to register these fake unions. And typically, the governor has some political crony running that labor board, so they register the fake unions knowing they don't represent the workers. So what happens is, if the workers want to actually have a real union, they can hold a vote and try and throw out the corrupt union. They have a new guarantee to have a vote and to actually have only contracts that have been voted on can be registered under the reformed Mexican labor law. And the revised NAFTA has a requirement that within 4 years, every single one of those old registered protection contracts that didn't have the workers' votes have to be redone, revoted, either reaffirmed with a real vote or thrown out and replaced with a real union and real contract. Again, if this happens, it's going to be transformational. So big if, but it would be transformational. So right now, I'm going to use the example of Matamoros. That's in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. So there's some states like Chihuahua, like where Juarez is, there has never been an independent union contract ever registered. They just won't take them. They find a reason to throw them out. They only take the crooked contracts. Tamaulipas occasionally will take an independent one. So you're working at a plant. Here's a really sad and real example. Most of the bosses have ignored the COVID emergency decrees to shut. They tell the workers, you have to come in, you're going to lose your job. And here's all your back wages we're holding. And, they just intimidate and pressure them. No safety protection. So a bunch of workers get sick and die. It happened. It's heartbreaking. And the workers go out and wildcat strikes. And then they say, that's it. We need a real union. So for instance, in Matamoros, this labor lawyer named Susana Prieto came to those workers and started negotiating on their behalf. And they basically founded a new union, which they registered a contract, they registered representation with, and they basically laid out demand terms for a contract. She took it to the labor board for reasons still unknown. The labor board accepted it. And then weeks later, they realized the dues were still being deducted and given to the old unofficial CTM union. that had just lost representation. So the workers started to do a sit-in about that. Eventually, as it became clear that they were going to get a real contract, that they were going to get a real union, the union was going to require much higher wages. And this lawyer, Susana Prieto, had worked with workers in the border states, are ready to have gotten a very big pay raise when AMLO became president, making the bosses there follow AMLO's minimum wage increase, which they were not. Basically, the state governors in those two states decided they had to get rid of her. So first, Tamaulipas charged her with a bunch of crazy trumped up mutiny. I mean, just like crazy Inquisition era charges that aren't used in Mexican law, and threw her in a really dangerous jail with a bunch of real criminals, 2 political prisoners and thousands of people who actually had committed crimes. No bail. She was denied bail 4 times. She was locked up for 3 weeks, and on just fake charges about, inciting a riot, etc. And eventually they let her out on the condition only that she would leave that state where her law office is, her family is, her house. She would not go to the labor court ever for 2.5 years. Even though she's a dual US citizen, she would not leave the country. And she would move to Chihuahua, the neighboring state, where, as it turns out, she found when she arrived 2 more arrest warrants were waiting for her to swoop her back up and lock her up again, also on fake charges. So the mutiny charges that she led a protest, and the time she was supposed to be leading a protest, she was in a different state in court. So it's just all crazy made up stuff. There's a kidnapping charge in there. I mean, it's totally made up. It's to intimidate, to lock her up, and to tell anyone else who wants to actually try to organize workers' rights, you try and actually implement this law, implement this new agreement, this is what's going to happen to you.
So she's actually being made an example of in a way to chill the environment for anybody else to try to form an independent union. Now, you referenced AMLO, and that's President Obrador. And I remember that when he was elected, he was partly elected on this sense that he was this populist. He was going to look out for the people against the corrupt system. And I guess me being just a natural skeptic, I was a little skeptical. And in fact, I'm wondering now that NAFTA has come into effect, he has, in theory, some say over whether this is going to be implemented in the proper way and whether the judiciary and the courts are going to basically enforce the agreement, make sure that workers are protected. So here he comes to Washington, he embraces Trump. And so have you lost faith in Obrador's willingness to really look out for workers in the way, at least, that he, in rhetoric, claimed he would?
So I think that vis-a-vis this particular situation with NAFTA implementation, it's too early to say if there's really been betrayal. It is the case that he did not intervene on the federal level, for instance, with the Minister of Justice, to shut down those state level processes. It's state criminal prosecutions, but more broadly, it is political persecution. And so there certainly are human rights and civil rights interventions from the Capitol that could have been made. He has spoken against how Susanna is being treated and spoken about the importance of labor rights. He did raise the minimum wage as he promised. However, vis-a-vis the broader implementation of the NAFTA, it has not been highly hope-inspiring. And the Mexican government's basically saying, well, we're behind because of COVID. But the way that they have planned to implement those obligations is they've broken down the different states in Mexico into 3 zones. The border zone, where a lot of the manufacturing is the last phase in. Every year, one of those zones will get the new labor institutions. They're supposed to be independent labor courts, et cetera. And there's a national institution that's supposed to replace a basically tripartite system where the boss had a say and give a much more independent sort of judicial review of labor contract disputes. That is behind in its implementation, and the funding is a little sketchy. Again, Mexico's saying it's because of COVID, but it was already falling behind before the pandemic started. So there are, I would say, concerns about the level of commitment and follow through on the institutional and funding level. What's an interesting development that we don't know what it means yet is literally last night AMLO met with Susana Prieto. We're making a
Mhm.
little news here. She wrote a letter, which is available on our website, as is also the statement of her case, all of it in Spanish and in English at tradewatch.org, www.tradewatch.org. Look under the new NAFTA. That meeting, she did a very brief statement about it afterwards. She said that it was hopeful. It's got to translate into real action. The real
Right.
action is the criminal charges have to be dismissed.
Right.
The bullshit with still collecting workers' money for a union that they've thrown out has to end. She, all of those conditions imposed on her of internal exile and not practicing her labor defense work needs to be lifted. But we'll see. At least he did have an audience with her after she wrote a letter 24 hours later asking him to see her. She was there.
So last question to wrap up our conversation. This was really fantastic as usual. Let's kind of connect domestic politics here to the situation in Mexico. Let's assume for a moment that Joe Biden wins the general election, Democrats take back the Senate and retain the House. And so there's a complete Democratic control of each branch of Congress and the presidency. Now, Joe Biden has been a longtime pro-free trader, for lack of a better term. He's supported when he was in the Senate, and also he supported the TPP when he was in the Obama administration. Is there any either mechanism that administration, a new administration, could use to force the Mexican government to live by the agreement in terms of the judiciary? Or do you think, and related question, do you think he would do such a thing, meaning Biden? Or is it basically, if Mexico doesn't take care of its own business, then nothing's going to happen?
So there are ways to enforce it from the US, and I suspect Biden would probably pursue those, if only because of the politics of it. I mean, one of the things that clearly he's recognized is that Trump made a lot of progress in key Midwestern states, particularly talking about these issues. The Biden campaign message about trade, the policies that they put forward, and for that matter, the Democratic platform are really much more in the right direction than, say, 4 years ago with Hillary Clinton. So the political lesson, I think, has been
Which isn't saying much, actually, but that's another topic.
The political lesson has been taken home. I was going there.
Yeah.
But it's also not super, it's not a super progressive policy position. But I think that there is opportunity that wouldn't normally be there given Biden's past votes. I think that we don't need to dread the prospect of what would happen on trade were he president, because the politics has shifted dramatically. And even if he were policy-wise inclined to do more of the same, I think that is something politically that's not doable. Now,
and I think you underscore, let me just say, I think you underscore and I want to make this important point because it's beyond trade, that really then it's up to us to fight these corporate powers, these influences, the lobbyists, because they are going to have great access to Biden. Biden is inclined, because he comes from that world. He has a lot of support from corporations. He's raised lots of money from Wall Street over his career. So this is really a point at which all the work you do and the movement part is so crucial, right?
Well, and that's what I was just about to say, which is
We're telepathic all the time, Lori.
I think that we need to be putting on the heat, but not just on Biden. Please God that we have Biden there in January to put the heat on. But right now, frankly, this president said he was fixing NAFTA. If this shit doesn't get fixed, he hasn't fixed anything. And so both as a political matter to make clear, as he's running around the country saying, I fixed NAFTA, everything's great, no more outsourcing. Yo, dude, in the 3.5 years you've been president, trade job loss has gone up. You can see that in the Trade Adjustment Assistance database at our website, tradewatch.org. But also, Mr. Blowhard, you passed the agreement. Are you going to implement it? So right now, the good news is the guy who's the U.S. trade representative, the only reasonable, effective, good person probably in the whole administration, the whole cabinet, Robert Lighthizer, is trying to figure out which cases he's going to bring. Because as I said, those rapid response cases are like a very practical 2x4 upside the boss's head. It's their money, it's their goods. They mess it up, they're going to take the pain. So some of those rapid response cases will almost certainly be filed. but we need to make sure that it happens, and it happens quickly, and there are a bunch of them in the fall. And then also, probably there will be what are called state-to-state cases, where if there's a bigger issue about systematic lack of enforcement, the institutions aren't being set up, or the funding isn't happening, then the US can basically use the NAFTA enforcement. But that's a much longer sort of fraught process that does or does not work. And I suspect that Robert Lighthizer as USTR will start all of that, if for no other reason, because that will take 6 months for the rapid response. If they don't start now, the Biden folks would have to start from scratch, and it'll take a while before someone's in office and blah, blah, blah.
So you always amaze me, even though we've spoken many, many times over the years, you always amaze me at how much you know about this and how much information you have at your fingertips and the incredible work you do. And so we're going to follow this on this show, this whole story about Susanna's situation, the implementation of NAFTA. We're going to have you back as we get both closer to the election and then after the election, assuming the politics change. Thanks so much for being on the show as usual.
Thank you. And folks, if you want to be part of the pressure to get this change, you can sign up to get action alerts and actually be getting your members of Congress to help. Right now, Chuy Garcia, the congressman, progressive, wonderful congressman from Chicago, is doing an all-Congress sign-on about this exact set of issues to President AMLO. So again, tradewatch.org, sign up for action alerts, and you can be part of the change.
Do it. See you soon. Florida. When it comes to politics, you need not say much more than Florida to get people's temperature up. No pun intended here, actually, since it's also now the center of the pandemic COVID eruption, thanks to its completely moronic governor. But Florida also points up a longer-term challenge to be quite conscious of as political people and as activists in our community. It has one of the worst Democratic state parties in the country, and that's saying a lot. Worst in the sense of sclerotic at so many levels, with most incumbents only interested in protecting their own little kingdoms with little interest in competing throughout the state. Which is where Bob Lynch comes in. Working with a coalition of activists, he's one of the cadre of first-time candidates jumping into politics this year to compete at every level of government. He's running for the 116th district in the Florida State House, a district that is in South Florida. So, Bob, I gather from your background, and you've had quite an interesting background, that you've been interested in politics, but you aren't necessarily someone who thought your whole life, I think, of jumping in and running for office yourself, right?
Yeah, no, that's correct. My interest first started after 9/11 because I was a sophomore at NYU. And so obviously it hit on a personal level. And then just sort of being very encapsulated with watching what was going on in our lead up to the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, I decided to study politics. And so I actually got a degree in politics. And I think I studied it enough to realize that I didn't want to go into politics anymore. And so I wound up working on Wall Street, had a pretty good career in finance, and I moved overseas for a while, lived in Spain for a number of years. And then I came back just as Donald Trump was winning. And after being gone for so long, I just couldn't understand, how it had happened. And so I got really immersed in the Russia investigation and then trying to see how I could help out in terms of flipping the midterms. And then, obviously this wasn't my dream, but I believe that, Donald Trump is an existential crisis to this country, and all of us need to do whatever we can to help with that. And then also on the Florida specific level, our governor, Ron DeSantis, is kind of like a tier 1A existential crisis for us. And I met with some of my team, and we kind of decided that me actually running for office would be the best use of my talents and my skill sets to kind of further those efforts.
Now, you are running in District 116 for the Florida House, but you've got a much bigger vision and something that drove you, it seems to me, from reading materials and what you actually wrote in jumping into this race. And I want to quote from a quite interesting narrative that you posted at Blue America. I want to quote one paragraph and then let you kind of riff on that. And here's what you said. District 116 is at the epicenter of every major political battle involving South Florida this year. The district is part of three different congressional districts, Florida 25, Florida 26, and Florida 27. For reasons that have never been properly explained to me, the Democratic Party decided to let career GOP hack, I like the way you frame that very subtly, Mario Diaz-Balart get reelected completely unopposed. There are parts of my district where I will be the second Democrat on the ballot after Joe Biden. This should never happen. Every resident of Florida should have the opportunity to choose which party they would like to represent them at every level. So your critique and your vision has a lot to do with what I think you see as a complete weakness of strategy on the part of the state Democratic Party.
Yeah, well, I think the best way to win is to run everywhere, knowing that, you know, you are going to lose in certain districts just because of the actual demographics or the gerrymandering or whatever else. And whether it was, you know, a function of leadership or strategy or actually just, you know, resources, the party does not have, you know, infinite resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so I worked with a number of different folks, including Dr. Janelle Christensen, who's the head of the Florida Democratic Environmental Caucus, and a guy named Dr. Fergie Reed, who's part of 90 for 90, who led this effort in Virginia of competing for every seat. And we kind of came in at the last minute too, and were able to recruit almost 36 different candidates to run in different state house districts and state senate districts. We raised the money for them to get on the ballot. And the idea there was kind of something like our agricultural commissioner, Nikki Fried, who was the only statewide Democrat elected since 2016, put into place, which was kind of called the lose by less strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning you go into places that, you know, maybe you are supposed to lose by 90%, but if you lose by 80% there and then you do it, you know, you replicate it 30, 50 times over, you start really compressing the margins. And what I say in terms of it being the epicenter, and there's sort of two things, I think. The first is that Miami-Dade County is probably the only major city in the country that is also in a state that has a Republican governor, 2 Republican senators, a Republican state house, and a Republican state senate, and a Republican mayor. And so I think that is really a perfect way to illustrate the complete failure and incompetence of Republican leadership. Because
so part of the theory, I think, about going into every district, and it's been discussed, I think, nationally. I mean, Howard Dean, when he was chair of the DNC, I'm not a huge Howard Dean fan, but he did have this notion about having a 50-state strategy and competing in places that were so-called red states, especially in the South, like Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and not giving them up. I suppose that you could look at competing in those districts at 2 levels. One is lots of people don't vote. Let's face it, in America, because it's not compulsory. So in theory, if you're competing and you do a smart turnout strategy and outreach, you could bring out people who might vote for you who normally wouldn't vote. And the second thing, which I think is to me more interesting and important, is that lots of our issues as progressives, one argues, and many of people have made this point, that they appeal to people beyond the spectrum. For example, everybody wants healthcare for all. Everybody thinks the climate is in danger. Most people think the rich get away with not paying enough taxes, and you can go down the list. So in theory, those populist issues could appeal in so-called red districts that we're not competing in, right?
Yeah, I think a couple things on that. One, I mean, I can't even imagine, you know, back to that era when Howard Dean's screaming was, you know, deemed career ending. And then, you know, look at the circus we have, you know, every single day now. It's just tells you, you know, how far I wouldn't say how far we've gone down. But 2, so the interesting thing about my district 116 is that as you said, it sits in 3 congressional districts. We have a mayoral race in Miami-Dade County. And then obviously we have the presidential election. And so on paper, if you looked at my district, you'd probably say, you know, this is not the smartest district to go run in just because of, you know, past performance in different elections. My predecessor ran and he lost 57-43 in 2018. So, you know, like the sort of traditional metrics that people and consultants look at to say whether a race is winnable, it probably doesn't make sense. However, the disaster of the Trump administration and the DeSantis administration, I think you sort of throw out all the traditional metrics, whether it's the Cook PVI or whatever else, because we've never had anything like this. But my intention, obviously, I'm planning on winning the race, but is to go in and help hold Florida 26, which is Debbie Merkersell Powell's seat, and help hold Florida 27, which is Donna Shalala's seat. There's also a state Senate race in my district. And then obviously getting any incremental vote for Joe Biden helps. And the fact that no one was even going to run in my district, to me, means you're going to leave a number of votes on the table. Mm-hmm. And also, to what you said in terms of driving voter turnout, you can't do that if you don't have someone locally on the ground. And so while I think of myself as someone who can best represent, the constituents of the 116th district, I also think of myself as almost a de facto, but highly skilled and highly organized field organizer for the Biden campaign and for the 2 congressional districts I'm in. Because I'll be in there, and while I'm giving out my own literature, I can also, give out literature on Joe Biden and them. And I think me being a young guy and not a typical politician, I think I can get some people who might not have voted in the past, and maybe some people who voted in 2016 but didn't vote in 2018. And then just one other thing on that, while I think people down here would agree with the values that you've espoused, because they're kind of common sense things, and this becomes just another sort of cultural thing, like when you have Latino strategy that's being run out of Arizona or Texas coming down into South Florida, like we're a very different subset of the Hispanic community. And words like progressive, while they might make sense to us in English and everything, if you're from South America or you're from Cuba or somewhere else, the word progressive has very different negative connotations. That is sort of like a communist light or a socialist light thing. And most of the people who have immigrated to South Florida from these countries have bad experiences with brutal dictatorships that, committed atrocities under the banner of socialism or communism or progressivism, which, progressista.
And so I get that. There's no question that a label can sometimes be used against you, but I guess the way I framed it, and I wonder what you think about it, since you're talking to the voters there, it's about a specific issue. So you go to that same person who might feel a little turned off by the word progressive because of the reasons that you mentioned. But if you say to that person, don't you think you should have free health care? Don't you think we should get rid of these insurance companies that are driving you crazy and the pharmaceutical companies that are bankrupting you? And don't you think that the rich people should pay more taxes and so on? Don't you think that has traction?
Oh, 100%. But then it kind of just comes down to the effectiveness of propaganda.
Yeah.
Where you have these people who will shudder at some of those words that are, either on food stamps or on Medicare or are collecting Social Security. But so I think one of the things that goes back to how important it is to run candidates in every district is you need people who are on the ground and understand the different nuances in those specific districts. And obviously just knowing the language is a very important part of it. And I speak Spanish, so I can explain those, intricacies. And often when people go in from a top down approach, those tiny little nuances are lost. Whereas what we're trying to do is go from the ground up. And so we know what works and how to message certain things in specific communities. It's like you said, I think these are things that, everybody wants. And then also, the environment is an issue that polls over 75%.
And local candidates and their understanding, obviously, in any place, any state, make a difference. And I totally agree with you. The top-down approach is always a failure, even if you're coming into a district where progressive is a value that people embrace. And so I wonder if in that way that you're a local candidate, the goal is twofold. So let's start with the first one. One is to change the conversation in the long term to make those progressive values that I think you and I share about universal health care and so on, and taxing the rich and making sure that people don't die from a pandemic, for example, and that we have competent government, those things are something that you leave in place for later races.
Yeah, I think the main thing that we're supposed to be discussing at this point, with the fact that, Floridians are dying at a rate that is higher than, a Hurricane Irma every single day.
Mm.
And, more Floridians have now died because of COVID-19 than all of the hurricanes in the history of the state of Florida combined.
Mm.
And so I think the main thing right now is to really just run on a platform of holding people accountable for what's gone on. Because while the Republicans in the country and in the state have basically just been, stripping things off and selling it for parts, now we're at the point where people are dying and people are on the verge of starvation because they can't access unemployment. And I'm trying to shift that conversation away from, the typical right-wing propaganda that just throws out these words, progressivism and socialism, and, tries to paint us as the bad guys and saying like, hey, we're talking about basic levels of competency for, certain vital services that the government is supposed to perform for you. And whether that is keeping you safe from your kids getting shot in schools, or preventing sea level rise from, wiping out our tourism economy, or providing universal health care, or, providing basic wages for people, these are all things I think people would agree with. I mean, they're common sense issues that I think, depending on how you actually frame them, the majority of Americans would be on board with. And then it just becomes a function of like how you actually message it. And I think you're right that, like, yes, we can plant the seed for a lot of things going forward, but none of that happens if Donald Trump is reelected. And that is the fundamental goal right now, is to get rid of this guy.
So let me ask you two final questions. And the first one is a very specific one about how the conversation about race, in light of George Floyd being murdered and the uprisings around the country and the amazing turn, even in so-called conservative forums like NASCAR, for example, and sports, baseball, people are all of a sudden saying Black Lives Matter. How is that being talked about in your district?
Well, I think it's fascinating here because it's not just a racial component. There's also, a massive ethnicity conversation that goes on. And I think people from South American countries have a very different experience with race relations than we do. A lot of times their countries are classified as sort of like white, mixed, and then maybe indigenous. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely a very high degree of racism and classism and prejudice within the Hispanic community down here. And so, like I said, in terms of this being the epicenter of a lot of political things, this is also like a very complicated epicenter of all kinds of different hot button issues, like race, like class, like ethnicity, like language. I mean, like, everyone down here, we sometimes get lumped into like this Latino bucket, but I mean, what does that mean? That's like 20 something countries, and
right. It's
all
very,
sorts of different social statuses, and
there's diverse.
There's Black people from Cuba, and there's Black people from Honduras, and so it's not as I think binary as it is in most major cities in the United States. And I mean, yes, it is in other parts of Miami, but particularly in my district, which is 90% Hispanic, the conversation becomes incredibly difficult to boil it down to something so quick. I mean, of course, Black Lives Matter, and I'll shout it from the rooftops, but I just don't think that that's necessarily the number one, issue on race in my particular district. However, it is a very big, important thing. It's just, it's so complicated and so messy, and then you're doing it in English and Spanish and Creole, and it just becomes very, very messy.
So final question to you in the last couple of minutes that we have. I want to circle back to where we really started in the paragraph that I read. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, hopefully you do win your race and you're able to do all the pieces about the politics internally in those districts that you seek to do. But where we started was the point about the Democratic Party statewide. And I guess your goal is to leave in place a notion throughout the state party that no district, no place should be left uncompeted for, that you should be fielding candidates, funding them, and it shouldn't just be in some way letting Republicans and bad Democrats, frankly, stay in power, but there should be competition.
Correct. And I think that's something that the Republican machine has been ruthlessly efficient at, for the past few decades. They'll run for basically every seat down to dog catcher. And that's how they've been able to get this control and stack the judiciary. And, they really consolidate local power and then send it all the way on up the chain, so that when they need to do something on the national level, it's like kind of, okay, everybody circle the wagons. And now we have like this efficient sort of machine. And I think that's something we need to do here, and not just from like a political tactical standpoint, but also just, I think, from a moral standpoint. Like it seems wrong to me that you could tell someone, we want you to vote for Joe Biden, but then we're not going to give you a chance of representation, like on your actual local level, where we're really talking about things that impact people's lives, whether it's schools or transportation or whatever else. And I think you're just telling people, you're not worth it because you're traditionally in a red district. And I don't think that that's the right message to send. And that's something that, myself and my fellow candidates are really trying to do. Yes, our goal is to flip the Florida State House and the State Senate this year, and I think we will, which has massive implications on the census and redistricting going forward, but also to leave a blueprint or a foundation that, this is something that should be done in every election, not just this one because of, the enormous implications, but it's something that should be done going forward.
But I want to point out, and just to underscore this notion that you are, whether you're doing it explicitly now or not, you're coming up against the Florida Democratic State Party leadership, which, and I'm going to say this on my part, is one of the worst state parties in the country. And I come out of New York originally, which has one of the worst state parties also. And I mean that in terms of control, and really their goal simply is to make sure that their people and only their incumbents stay in power. And they don't really care about those districts that are uncompeted for. So in some way, you're injecting something that is really a challenge to the whole philosophy of the way that entrenched Democratic Party has operated for so long.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree. And I think at times, though, we need to sort of separate out what we mean when we say something like the Florida Democratic Party, because obviously, there's the Florida Democratic Party, which is headed up by Terry Rizzo, who I have a great working relationship with, and she completely gets the goal that we're trying to put forth and is trying to help our candidates. But then you also have, the actual incumbents in the Senate and the actual incumbents in the House. And so it's very hard to speak about it as if it's just some sort of
monolith. Fair enough.
This moves this and this moves that. But I think what we did was a legitimate wake-up call to them, as, also, how it is in politics. Like a lot of organizations and stuff, like you don't get famous and whatever backing losers. Like, it's very easy to only back winners.
Hopefully you will win your race and you'll be there for a long time. And I really thank you for coming on the show, and we'll keep tracking your race. Good luck.
No, can I just say one more thing about that is, and I don't say that we're losers, but I just mean it's very easy for all kinds of outside groups who make endorsements and whatever else. They want to pick favorites just because they like to run up their own personal score. And I think the real way to make a difference is to invest in races that are not traditionally thought of as competitive. And that is the way we can change Florida. And then we need to export that strategy to every state in the country. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
And thanks for being on the show. Good luck.
You too, man. Thanks. Cheers.
So that'll do it for this week's show. Thanks to my guests, Lori Wallach and Bob Lynch. Our editor, as usual, is David Hebden. Our major sponsor is the American Postal Workers Union. You too can become a sponsor of the show at whatever level you can afford. You can do that by going over to workinglife.org. You can click on the podcast tab and then follow your way over to Patreon, where you can become a sponsor on a regular basis, say monthly basis, or on a one-time basis, which would be great as well. Or if you're more comfortable, you can use ActBlue. We've partnered up with ActBlue to support this show, and you can just go over to ActBlue, look for the Working Life Network with Jonathan Tassini, and you can become, again, a regular sponsor, perhaps a monthly sponsor, or a one-time sponsor. Your support is crucial. It helps us bring this great information to you. The words, the ideas, the thoughts, the passion of so many activists, leaders, and people who are the future of our country and the world. Thanks for tuning in. Look forward to having you back next week.